Hello. Welcome to Psychedelics Past, Present, Future, a lecture series organized by the Center for Access to Information and Justice at the University of Winnipeg. I wish to acknowledge that we're situated on ancestral Indigenous lands on Treaty 1 territory. I acknowledge these lands are the heartland of the Métis people, and as a settler here, I acknowledge our water comes from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. In this lecture series, we're featuring speakers researching psychedelics, drugs more broadly, and consciousness-altering rituals and practices. Psychedelics is a topic that obviously has many justice implications, but touches on much else from philosophy and history, literature and culture, indigenous knowledge and relations, chemistry, and ecology. Uh, Future talks are going to look at LSD on the prairies, the Chacruna Institute and Movement, endogenous DMT in the pineal gland, drug legalization in June and July. But today we're going to be looking back in time. CAIJ is organizing these talks because the drug war here and everywhere is oppressive and violent and must be ended. Some people find healing in psychedelics during the pandemic too, but surely after, given the new focus on psychedelics and healing and PTSD. Some people want to investigate consciousness, explore the infinite present. Others are just curious. Some have a passion for their sacred relationship with plant teachers and medicines. There are nearly 100 universities running clinical trials on psychedelics today, and sometimes it's claimed we're entering the second phase of psychedelics, the first being the 50s and the 60s. But if we look back, if we consider all the knowledges and practices that have been repressed going back centuries, thousands of years, it must really be more like the fourth or the fifth phase. To look back, we need people who are thinking about the ancient past and the texts that describe what may have been happening then. If we dig deep enough, maybe these knowledges and practices will be restored, revived, and rekindled for all. Thanks to the Winnipeg event team and media team for all the support and work on this. Here's the format for today. Our speaker is going to speak for 20-25 minutes. I'm going to ask a few questions, our co-host will, and then we'll open up the Q&A tab. Make sure to enter your questions in that Q&A tab on the bottom of the screen. Now, let me introduce the very important people and thinkers here today. First, let me introduce and ask our co-host, Professor Jane Barter, to join. Professor Jane Barter is Professor of Religion and Culture at the University of Winnipeg. Professor Barter has published several books on Christianity. Professor Barter also publishes in the areas of feminist theory and continental philosophy of religion. Thank you for being here. And now today's speaker, Brian Muraresku, has a BA in Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit from Brown University and a JD from Georgetown University. As a member of the New York Bar, he's been practicing law internationally for 15 years. The Immortality Key, The Secret History of the Religion with No Name, is his book, which he will be speaking about today. It is a beautifully crafted book and an elegantly orated audiobook. It's ethnographic in its detail, scholarly in its semiotic and exegetical inquiry, literary in its prose, insightful on death and dying at a time of great suffering across our planet, yet full of hope about how ancient worlds can instruct us on how a really living life ought to be cultivated today and tomorrow. Brian, thank you for being here. The floor is yours for your presentation.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Kevin. Professor Barter, it's an honor to be here with your community. And without further ado, I'd like to share some slides, if that's okay. So I'm going to do a little share screen here. And looks like it should be popping up okay. And if I present over here, I'll wait for the thumbs up from Kevin. And looks like we are rolling. Okay, cool. So for those who don't know, this is the cover of my book, The Immortality Key, The Secret History of the religion with no name. I'll explain both of those concepts as we go along here. I guess the headline is that this book represents the past 12 years of my life researching the ancient mysteries. I am an attorney, still an attorney, practicing attorney by trade, but I do have this background in classics. And I was always really struck by the mysteries of Eleusis and what, if any, relationship those ancient Greek mysteries could have had to early Christianity. I'm also a lifelong Catholic and studied with the Jesuits for many years. So it's a very personal book. It's the pagan and the Christian bumping up against each other. It's science and religion. It's the rational versus the non-rational. And it's about the identity crisis in the United States and Canada and other Western democratized nations, and my own personal identity crisis of trying to fit in these two parallel narratives about the past. You know, there's this idea that the ancient Greeks birthed all this philosophy and religion, arts and sciences, democracy, all these things we take for granted. And then here comes Christianity 2,000 years ago to save our soul. Has been the prevailing narrative. And I think it's important to point out that to the ancient Greeks, there was a very sophisticated, many different sophisticated systems for acquiring knowledge of the divine. Gnosis is the word in Greek for that. And some of this inquiry, some of this questing probably made its way into early Christianity. The big question is, what, if anything, does psychedelics have to do with all this? And that's where I started to pick up the scent 12 years ago. And it's largely following in the footsteps of the men you see pictured here. In the large picture there, that's my friend, Professor Carl Ruck, who is still at Boston University and now 85 years old. Back in 1978, you see him at the lower left there, together with his colleagues, mentors in some senses, R. Gordon Wasson on the right, and Albert Hofmann, the Swiss chemist who famously discovered LSD. They put out this crazy idea that the ancient Greeks were using drugs to find God. And they were largely excoriated for daring to suggest that the founders of Western civilization were high on drugs when they were drafting the blueprints for all these things that I just mentioned, arts and sciences, democracy. And so their book, The Road to Eleusis, came out in 1978. And largely, I think through Albert's work with LSD, they struck up a hypothesis. Their hypothesis was that this kykeon beverage, or kykeon, you sometimes hear it called, it was some kind of spiked beer beverage. And their hypothesis was that this ancient beverage that was used in the Eleusinian mysteries, it was somehow spiked with an LSD-like substance that was derived from ergot. And ergot, for those who don't know, looks like this. It's actually very pretty. They're on the left. So ergot is this naturally occurring fungus that regularly will infect cereal crops like barley, wheat, rye, things like this. And as far as we can tell, it's been around as long as the domesticated crops have been around. That's 12, 13,000 years at the very least. I mean, so just in the abstract, it's kind of an elegant theory because ergot is so common. It could have popped up on the grain, the cereals, in and around ancient Eleusis, where these mystery ceremonies took place for close to 2,000 years, by the way, from about 1500 BC to the 4th century AD, when they were largely exterminated by the newly Christianized Roman Empire. And because Albert himself was able to synthesize LSD from that little blackened, slender kernel there, it's kind of an elegant theory. And so amongst all the theories out there for what could have been happening in the ancient mysteries of Eleusis, I kind of went down the ergot rabbit hole just to kind of, do some diligence on this theory from 1978. There's lots of other wonderful psychedelic candidates that have been proffered over the ensuing decades, but I really wanted to dig into ergot just because, I had the sense that Albert really leaned into this idea for a reason. But in 1978, there wasn't any hard scientific data to prove this one way or the other. We weren't finding ergot in chalices and vessels 42 years ago. And since then, the science has advanced. The archaeobotany, the archaeochemistry has come along with other disciplines. And it's shed new light on how we think about the past, what our ancient ancestors were actually consuming, and whether or not this crazy hypothesis has any merit to it. So, after doing about a decade's worth of research into this theory and the surrounding theories about the Greek mysteries and psychedelics, I finally struck off to Eleusis itself. I'd never been till a couple of years ago. And I went there to speak to the excavator about this crazy hypothesis with which she was very familiar and very unconvinced. Miss Puppy Papangeli couldn't have been more accommodating and nice to me. We had a fun conversation walking through the very ruins of Demeter's temple right there, the Telesterion. You can see, not in the foreground, but in the midground, you can see those battered chunks of marble that once formed this ancient sanctuary that I sometimes call the spiritual capital of the ancient world. I'll sometimes say it's kind of like the Vatican of the ancient world. What you're looking at there on the right is a pilgrimage site, and it called to the best and brightest of Athens and Rome for, like I said, about 2,000 years, including folks like Plato, Pindar, Sophocles, all the way into Marcus Aurelius in the Common Era. This thing survived, and it survived on the backs of a vision. You know, we don't know much about what was happening inside that temple because it was secret. And to reveal what you saw, what you witnessed in that temple, was to expose yourself to death, quite literally. So all we have are hints and clues and little testimony that leaked out. But what seems to survive is this concept of a vision. Some kind of visionary encounter took place. Was it a theatrical production? Was it something that was envisioned in the mind? This is where Wasson and Hoffman and Ruck started thinking about these psychedelic theories. Maybe this kukion potion that we know is attested from the ancient literature had some kind of magical substance that helped to facilitate this vision. And I love the Eucrates votive relief there on the bottom left. It's obviously from the classical period. It was found right there in the ruins. And at least according to Carl Caregni, one of these scholars of antiquity writing in the 1960s, he says, he surmises that the person who left this as a votive offering to Demeter and her daughter Persephone, that he left this as a testament to the fact that his blindness had been healed in these ceremonies at Eleusis, which is a very romantic idea, unprovable, untestable, but a very romantic notion that even the blind could take part in this vision. Again, that's almost universally attested. This vision that Professor Ruck calls the culminating experience of a lifetime. What could that vision have possibly been? We don't know, but there's lots of interesting artifacts you can check out in the Eleusis Museum right there. This is a plaque of Triptolemus surrounded by the goddesses who are associated with these mysteries. I mentioned Demeter, who's the goddess of the grain, her daughter Persephone, who's abducted into the underworld. Hecate, the patroness of witchcraft, also makes an appearance, but there in the middle is Triptolemus, riding his flying dragon cart. Triptolemus is kind of the missionary for these mysteries. So all the secrets took place there in Eleusis, 13 miles northwest of Athens. And then Triptolemus was tasked with carrying the knowledge of the grain outside Eleusis, outside Greece even. And I mentioned that only as a footnote because he'll pop up again in just a couple minutes. But I went to Eleusis really to examine some of those chalices in the hopes that just maybe some ancient organic residue was still in there. And Papangeli had to inform me that no, in fact, the chalices like you see there on the top left had all been cleansed for conservation purposes. So as far as I could tell, there was no actionable evidence, chemical or otherwise, that could shed any light on this mystery. So I had to take a step back and think about ancient beer generally. And in my book, I won't get into the details here, but I do trace the origins of fermentation back about 12,000 years to what you see there is Göbekli Tepe. Back in 2012, excavators together with a friend of mine, Martin Zarnkow, this German beer scientist, were able to detect trace amounts of calcium oxalate on those troughs and barrels you see on the right. It wasn't 100% positive signal, kind of hit or miss, somewhat inconclusive. They just released a new paper in last November, actually, which I was reading yesterday again. And it's still somewhat inconclusive whether they were mixing up some kind of gruel or a porridge or actually brewing beer. But there is some data to suggest, aside from the calcium oxalate, that beer was being brewed that long ago, which is interesting because this Göbekli Tepe is a pilgrimage site, just like Eleusis. Göbekli Tepe is a place where, as far as the German Archaeological Institute is concerned, is a place where the living might interact with the dead, sort of like Eleusis. And it's a place where the ancestors lived and the gods were communed with. Again, sort of like Eleusis. And just maybe there was a potion there that, although we can't trace it in an unbroken continuity may have actually found its way into the classical civilizations that follow, what, 9,000 years later, 10,000 years later. It's just an astonishing amount of time. So there's a huge gaps that we can't fill in. But as we get into the Mycenaean period, there on the right, you see Pat McGovern from the University of Pennsylvania. He famously did turn up the chemical signatures, the biomarkers for things like beer, wine, and mead. What he says, all mixed together in some of those vessels you see on the left, a pottery beer mug, right back to the 16th century BC, from a Mycenaean citadel just off the mainland of Greece. That's all we had though for many, many years. So we have signals of beer, signals of wine. On the right, he's holding artifacts from a Phrygian tomb several centuries later, 8th century BC, where again, this kind of mixture of beer, wine, and mead is popping up. But again, no psychedelics, no drugs. All we can basically tell is that yes, there was beer and wine and mead, and we have the signatures for it. But the big question is, where are the drugs? So if there's any merit to this ergot theory, I took a giant step back and looked around the ancient Mediterranean world for places where the Greeks could have had an additional influence. And that took me to Emporion, which kind of looks like an Asclepian figure looking out over the Aegean. That's on the coast of Spain, of northeast Spain, right there, what today is Catalonia. And there, this was founded by Greek colonists several centuries before the modern era. And what's interesting is that these colonists eventually made their way inland, and either their descendants or people who were influenced by their descendants come across this ritual sanctuary. Now, the archaeologists unearthed this sanctuary in the 90s, and it has all these really interesting Greco-Roman artifacts, like the altar of Pentelic marble you see there on the right, which only could have come from Mount Pentelicus in Greece. You see the Greco-Italic amphorae on the left there, which were excavated from these ritual pits that indicate the Pons had dug up. You have coins there from back on the colonial quarters showing Persephone and some kind of winged horse on the obverse. So lots of interesting Greek clues, not least of which the archaeologist points to the left as either Demeter or Persephone or some kind of female goddess. You see a Dionysian parade. That's a 5th century BC vase that was dug up on this Hellenic farmstead, virtually in the middle of nowhere. That vase could belong in a Greek dining room, an Athenian dining room. And I mentioned Triptolemus before at Eleusis, only to show you this picture here, which was the Kalathos on the left was dug up in the environs of this same Hellenic farmstead. It's the same Triptolemus on the same flying winged dragon cart that you would see in the museum at Eleusis. And so all the Eleusinian figures seem to be in attendance at this Greek or Hellenic sanctuary that really rose to prominence and was then destroyed in the 2nd century BC. But in this classical period, again, you have figures like Triptolemus, Demeter, Persephone, perhaps Dionysus. They're all there. And what is there in addition are these miniature vessels that were dug up in this ritual room. I call it a sanctuary. The archaeologist calls it a capilla domestica, a household shrine is the best way to translate that. So it's a very Greek influenced household shrine, 2nd century BC, where in addition to all these artifacts and things like dog sacrifice and very Dionysian cups, that's a kantharos right there in the middle, the 2-handled cup, which is only about this big, by the way. The archaeologists continued their excavations and started testing these things. And what they found under optical microscopy and SEM, scanning electron microscope, was actually that tiny chalice right there that's being offered at the top left, the way a sommelier would offer a miniature shot of wine or beer, actually did turn up positive for elements of beer residue, which is kind of shocking because you wouldn't envision something like that. I mean, an ancient shot glass as an actual container for beer. But what's even stranger is what else they found there. That's Carl Ruck on the right, the same 85-year-old Carl Ruck who back in 1978 put his career on the line and continued digging into this hypothesis about this ergotized beer for 4 decades. And he came with me to this cathedral, this beautiful Romanesque cathedral in Spain, where these chalices are now preserved, to take a look at it, because it wasn't just the fact that there was organic remains of beer in there. But interestingly, The archaeologists and the archaeobotanists over 20 years ago also turned up the microscopic traces of ergot. And so there, in that little chalice, is the first organic, you could say, archaeobotanical evidence to really support an otherwise crazy theory from 1978 about some kind of visionary or semi-toxic brew being drunk in what seems like mysteries that were meant to imitate, in some cases, or maybe even were inspired by the Eleusinian mysteries themselves in a Greek sanctuary that's kind of like the Eleusis of the West. So this is like an artist's recreation of what could have been happening there based on all the artifacts that were found. In addition to the ergotized beer chalice, interestingly, a human skull, a jawbone at least, was found. And embedded in the teeth of that jawbone, they also found ergot, which is very, very strange. And so it begins to point to something like a purposeful consumption. It's very difficult to prove, obviously, but Jordi, the archaeobotanist who was doing the work there in the 90s, did test a hand mill. There were different implements for grinding grain that were found in this sanctuary room. And interestingly, they did not turn up positive for ergot. It was only in the chalice. It was only in that human jawbone. So, I mean, the picture begins to come together of some kind of hybrid ceremony. The archaeologists say it has hints of Greek elements, Celtic elements, indigenous Iberian elements in some kind of ancestor skull cult in which a sacrament of beer that was spiked with ergot seems to be taking place, which is very, very strange for me, simply for the fact that it fits so nicely into this theory from 1978. What does it mean about Eleusis itself? I don't know. We can't extrapolate out beyond this site at Mas Castellar de Pontos. I mean, it's the right place at the right time where these mysteries could have had an influence over the Greek influenced Iberians to the west, but it doesn't mean that generations of Greeks were showing up at Eleusis for LSD. I think it just means that there's interesting data and there's probably more out there worth testing. And archaeochemistry, which can shed even more light onto this, is a relatively new discipline, and I think a powerful tool for looking into more vessels like this. So. That's the first half of my book, and I won't go into too much detail on the second half. But in the remaining, I guess, 6 minutes here, I'll just talk briefly about the implications on Christianity, because there are implications. The obvious carryover from the ancient Greek pagan world to Paleo-Christianity, as I call it, the first 300 years after the birth of Christ, is the ancient Greek language. The New Testament is written in ancient Greek. The audience for that obviously were ancient Greek speakers, and there wasn't a very tried and true boundary between the pagan and Christian world in those years. It was a border moment when some of these practices, potentially psychedelic or hallucinogenic, could have been adopted by some of the earliest Greek speaking generations of Christians. And so it raises questions about what the Eucharist could have looked like for some of those early communities. We're not talking about the Last Supper. We're not talking about what was happening in Israel or Palestine necessarily. I think we're talking about the way Christianity was adopted, particularly in the Greek-heavy parts of the ancient Mediterranean. And I'm thinking about Magna Graecia in particular, southern Italy. And I'll talk more about that in a second, obviously. But when you think about ancient wine, I think that's the other obvious linking point here. So we talked about ancient beer potentially being spiked with ergot and other things. Ancient wine at the time, I mean, I think the most important thing to point out is that ancient wine is routinely described as a concoction, the kind of thing in which drugs would be dissolved. This is a little excerpt from Dioscorides' Materia Medica in book 474. He's talking about one of these plants, one of these magical solanaceous plants, resulting in visions, essentially. And he calls it, right there in the Greek, you can see it, phantasias ou aedais. It produces not unpleasant visions. So the idea of spiking wine with different plants, sometimes healing, sometimes toxic, sometimes visionary, was fairly well known in the ancient world. It wasn't just Dioscorides. Galen writes a lot about this, obviously, before them, Theophrastus and others precedes them by many centuries. So this is a tradition really that goes back almost to the foundations of Western literature. Homer obviously talks about the Kukion. Circe, the famous witch, if known for anything else, it's for her mixing pharmaca lugra, these baneful drugs, into these potions to turn the men of Odysseus into pigs. Here's another interesting artifact from the classical period. There's on the left Hermes in his role of psychopomp, releasing spirits from the pithos of wine, which is very interesting. You can see a demon right there, kind of peeking its head up above the rim of the wine jar, being stuffed back down into the wine where it belongs, and this angelic figure rising off into the celestial heavens. The idea was that wine really was a vehicle for these otherworldly elements. And I think part of that is the very sophisticated pharmacopoeia that just isn't often studied in the ancient world. But again, it's getting more and more attention now. And so the big question is, this magical wine of Dionysus there on the left, how does the wine of Dionysus, the god of ecstasy and mystical rapture and theater, how does that wine become the wine of Jesus on the right? There's lots of really interesting parallels. And in my book, I spend a few chapters talking about the scholarship of a great scholar, Dennis MacDonald, who wrote just a great book about this called The Dionysian Gospel. And he analyzes the Greek from John's Gospel and compares it against the Greek of Euripides from 500 years earlier. And just lots of really interesting parallels that would only pop up when you're reading the original Greek of John's Gospel. It's difficult not to conclude that Christ is being presented in a very Dionysian sense in John's Gospel. And so we have to question why that's the case. And maybe the argument was being made that Jesus is kind of a newer, more improved version of this Dionysus. And there's no better example of that than the wedding at Cana, which is this, we all know the story of the magical transformation of water into wine. It only happens in John's Gospel. But this would have been known to ancient Greek speakers when they heard this story. From the Greek district of Elis, for example, on the Western Peloponnese, for centuries and centuries, there were stories told about empty water basins that were brought into the Dionysian temple. The priests lock the doors, come back the next morning, magically transformed to wine. Lots of stories about rivers running with wine on this Epiphany date, January 5th, January 6th in the ancient Greek world. Oddly enough, that's adopted as the Epiphany date in Christianity. I mean, there are lots of these different parallels that all inform the pagan continuity hypothesis. I don't want to overdo the comparisons or the parallels. I go through it in the book only to show that there is some kind of continuity there. For example, if you look at, this is one of my favorite excerpts from John's Gospel. It's John's description of the Eucharist. It's a bit different from the Synoptic Gospels in terms of its language. And I want to focus there particularly on verse 54 from the 6th chapter of John's Gospel. Very interesting Greek. I don't want to geek out on it too much, but hotroga mutensarka kaipino motohaima is this is the from the mouth of Jesus saying, whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood. Well, the word trogon there for eat doesn't really mean to eat. The trogon is a very unique word, does not occur very often in the Gospels. John is the only one who uses that to describe the Eucharist. It means to gnaw, to nibble, to munch, the way you would rip, flesh from the bone. It's a very strange word. It's intentionally graphic. In John 6:60, the people who are listening to the sermon from Jesus walk away in disgust because they have no idea what Jesus is talking about. So even though, obviously the Eucharist has Passover elements and the elements of Judaism in it, this language here and this very Greek vocabulary just wasn't appreciated by the people who were hearing about this. It's a very strange idea. It's a very pagan idea to munch on the flesh of Jesus. It amounts to cannibalism. Well, again, if you go back 500 years, the vocabulary of Euripides is swimming with this kind of imagery. There you see on the left, you see the Greek, the sarkos, the same flesh, the same blood, haimati in Greek, and these two big notions of sparagmos, tearing apart the flesh, and then the omophagon. This is right from Euripides, this glad meal of raw flesh that the followers of Dionysus would engage in when they were feasting on the sacrificial animals. This is where the word Eucharist comes from, by the way, the charen there, which I don't think means a glad meal, but it's a Thanksgiving meal. It's this Thanksgiving meal of raw flesh and blood. It's picked up in John, which doesn't mean anything necessarily and has nothing to do with psychedelics. But I just want to point out that this notion of the blood of the god being compared to the wine of that god is something that goes back many, many centuries, including from the Greek writer Timotheus, who has that phrase specifically, the haima bachiou, the blood of Bacchus, the blood of Dionysus, is a phrase that's used to describe this magical wine. And so here's the big question. If the wine of Dionysus was magical, why was it magical? Is it possible that some of these ingredients, some of these additives that we have in the Greek literature from back in Homer all the way through Dioscorides, these drugs, these pharmaca lugra that were routinely added to wine, is it possible that tradition made its way into early Christianity? Is that the segue from this one son of God, born of a virgin, whose grape becomes our spiritual drink? Is this how it transfers to the figure on the right, who becomes another son of God, born of a virgin, whose blood becomes the spiritual drink of the Mass? So these, we can go through lots of more exegesis. I'll end here because I'm over time, just by saying that just in the same way that I went looking for, the archaeobotanical data of ergotized beer, I did spend a good amount of time going through the journals looking for any scintilla of evidence about spiked wine. For many, many years, I was asking all these experts, archaeobotanical experts, archaeochemical experts, if there is any evidence for spiked wine with powerful drugs in antiquity. The answer often came back, no, there is no reliable data for this. But then as I was scouring the journals, I came across this interesting site, Villa Vesuvio. Interestingly, like the site in Spain, also excavated over 20 years ago and published in English in this paper here by Marina Ceraldi in the late 90s, inside the Villa Vesuvio, which is described in this paper as a pharmacy, kind of a farmhouse cum pharmacy. There were these giant dolia that were subjected to analysis, and inside the macrobotanical remains of all kinds of different plants were found. I think something like 56 different species were identified, but the interesting ones were seeds belonging to cannabis and opium and henbane and black nightshade. So a very kind of witchy mix straight out of Macbeth is sitting there for some reason. And again, we don't know why, and we don't know if it was consumed, why it was consumed as part of some ritual, Christian or not. I point to this interesting find from the Villa Vesuvio, the same way I point to the interesting find from Spain, which is that it seems like these potions really did exist, not just in the minds of Homer, not just in the writings of Dioscorides, or the imaginations of first century ritualistic drinkers, but in actuality, there was a pharmacopoeia, and there was a very sophisticated understanding of the botanical landscape and perhaps the mind-altering properties of these drugs. And so, I present this data really just as proof of concept for the fact that I think we need much more attention over these ritual beverages from the ancient world. And I think it does raise, very well-founded questions about the role of things like psychedelics or hallucinogens or drugs, medicine generally, that is largely overlooked or underreported or some combination of the two. And I think it's a very exciting time for a field like archaeochemistry over the next decade, which can just shed a lot of light over the wine of antiquity, the beer of antiquity, and why these things were consumed and what it has to do with religion and ritual and the rise of Western civilization and all the rest of it. So there's the immortality key, and I'll leave you with this one image from the catacombs under the streets of Rome. You see women mixing up wine right there in the Latin. Women with very Greek names are being told to mix wine in ceremonies that even by the Vatican's guidebook that describes these frescoes from the 3rd and 4th century describes these as very Eucharistic vigils. Right there in the Latin, miscemi Irene, mix it up for me, Irene, which means peace in Greek, or mix it up for me, agape, the Greek word for love. So lots of interesting rabbit holes here to go down. And I think the question is open about, the Eucharist of Paleo-Christianity and what it meant to people of the time. So I'll end there before I go on.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you for investigating these questions and doing this research, and for being here today to present on your work. I think now I'll just take a few minutes ask a few questions, I'll turn it over to Professor Barter, and then we'll check on the Q&A tab at the bottom. Again, if you do have questions, please put your questions down in that Q&A tab. So maybe I'll start with just a couple questions. So I've found as a kind of newcomer to this area of study that some classicists continue to really dismiss the work of Ruck, the hypothesis there, and deny any possibility of consciousness altering substances being used in ancient Greece, even though psychoactive plants are being used by nearly every other culture on Earth at that time and in the region all around. So one classicist actually emailed me and said, "No, this is all a dead end." I thought that was kind of an anti-intellectual stance to take. But why do you think that some people feel like this when we do have more bioarchaeological evidence and archaeochemistry evidence of consciousness altering substances and rituals? They always seem to go along with rituals as well from the ancient past than we did, say, 50 years ago. And also, what does it say about the discipline of classics that some pockets of it are resistant to exploring and testing these hypotheses?
That's a great question. Maybe it is a dead end. You have to be skeptical about this stuff, and I think we have to stick to the data. That's why part of me was really interested in just researching and writing about this stuff, and I often questioned myself, like 10 years ago, what the whole point of it was. It wasn't until, in my case, honestly, it wasn't until some of these archaeobotanical reports or archaeochemical reports that I really thought there was something worth writing about here. I think the exegetical work and looking to the ancient textual sources and some of the early frescoes is fascinating stuff. But as a skeptic myself, but a curious one, I think for me it's the science, it's the archaeochemistry that convinced me there's a lot that hasn't been studied here. But I mean, even on the textual side, I'm not sure if it's a bias per se, but there certainly is a blind spot. I think even the hardened skeptic would agree. When you look at Galen, for example, something like the Kuhn edition is like 22 volumes, over 1,000 pages each. A colleague of mine says that there's more Greek of Galen out there than all of Homer and Pindar and Plato and Aeschylus and others combined, which is kind of a staggering thing to think about. And it's not been translated to English. So we really can't say how much we know about the pharmacology of the ancient world. It just isn't a popular field of study. Maybe even ancient medicine in general. It's a very niche field of study. So maybe it's a dead end, maybe it's not. I mean, I think we ought to translate Galen first and then decide from there. I think we should test, I don't know, another 1,000 vessels, 20,000 vessels, 100,000 vessels before we decide what was happening in the ancient world or not. But I think the scientific method does matter, and that's the one that I'm following.
Yeah. I also wanted to follow up about the site in Spain. So it seems to me that Greek religion, it's really diverse. You've got city-states that are kind of autonomous and diverse, and they're practicing their own rituals. There's so many gods and goddesses, and they're kind of worshiping different gods and goddesses. There's a lot of variation. So do you think it's possible that the hallucinogenic ritual in Catalonia in 300 BCE maybe is not connected to Eleusis? Maybe it was a kind of mutation of some earlier ritual practice.
Yeah, of course, we have to keep that notion open. The assemblage of Greek artifacts is very strange. It's hard to explain away. It doesn't mean it's influenced by Eleusis or the Eleusinian rites, which I make sure to talk about in the little epilogue to part 1 there. It just raises questions about this old theory from 1978. I mean, the archaeologist herself, Enriqueta Bones, is quick to point out that there's something happening here. It's a hybrid of Hellenic, Celtic, and indigenous Iberian influence, the Indigetes, the Iberians in that part of what today is Catalonia. Interestingly, the only reason I got to Mas Castellar de Pontos was through looking through the journals and other archaeobotanical finds that Jordi Treserras, the archaeobotanist, had been working on in the 90s. And there was another site that belonged to the Bacai. I'm not sure if many people know about the Bacai in central Spain, but around the same period, there was another spiked beer. In addition to the ancient containers of beer at the necropolis of Las Ruedas, which is not very well known, but there around the same time, the archaeologists turned up another kind of chalice, a Greek chalice, by the way. It's a kernos. They call it a kernos. I have some pictures I can track down. But they also found the remains of beer and Hyoscyamus, which is another one of these solanaceous plants. So it's there was something happening in ancient Iberia that's difficult to explain away. The relation, if any, that's a great lawyerly phrase. The relation, if any, to Eleusis is an open question. What I would like to do is test some vessels from Greece to figure this out one way or the other. So yeah, I think all hypotheses have to be on the table.
In chapter 6 and 7, you review and you invoke these terms, kukion, pharmakon, and what's the word for ecstasy again? Ecstasis. And you're really well situated to explore these issues of translation because you have training in classical languages and romantic languages, so you can find these sites, elsewhere where the findings are written in Spanish. Do you think that the terms kikion, pharmakon, they maybe have other denotations and connotations at the time, or how definite is the link to drugs? I think you're convincing that it maps onto mythology. There is a connotation there of consciousness altering, but do they also sometimes mean, like, I don't know, vitality or nourishment, or I don't know what we would call it today, vitamins?
The only way to answer this is we don't know. I mean, I love that answer, is that we don't know what kukion means. So kukion, it means something like mixed beverage. And when I was looking at the images from Göbekli Tepe there, I was quick to point out, as the scientists do in their most recent paper from last November, that it has the markings of something like a porridge or a gruel or a beer. It's very difficult to find unless you find that calcium oxalate, which is one of these biomarkers for fermentation. It also pops up in scenarios where beer is not being fermented, by the way, or grains aren't being fermented. It's difficult to really determine what was going on in these ancient chalices. And the language is even harder, I would say. So we know it's a mixed beverage. We know that when Homer talks about it, in the hands of Circe, by the way, in the Odyssey, it is very closely connected to this idea of pharmaka. Pharmaka lugra and kukion, and the verbs describing it are all there in the 10th book of the Odyssey. So even as far back as then, this idea of the kukion being a mixed beverage, potentially with drugs, is already there. What that means in the classical period, we have no idea. We have even less idea what was, whether the recipe could have changed, whether there were secular kukion versus religious kukion, whether the kukion in 435 BC was different from the kukion in 434 BC. There's so little we know about these beverages. I mean, so I'm comfortable saying a kukion is a mixed beverage that could potentially have included drugs, obviously. Pharmaka, that's hard not to associate with drugs. Peter Kingsley, the great scholar, writes about this. At times, there are instances where that word is used to kind of to allude to the incantations that are used while gathering plants and herbs and things like that. But I mean, undoubtedly, pharmaka that word is pointing to, and that's why we use the word pharmacy. It's pointing to something associated with witchcraft on the one hand. That's the word pharmakais. And why witches and warlocks are so good at using these baneful herbs. I mean, beyond that, we really don't know, though.
Thank you. I'll pass it over to Professor Barter now.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the service that you're providing to folks like me in religious studies to open up questions about the ancient world and to find, I guess, a key that's rather intriguing and interesting to students. So thank you for your service there for us. So my questions have to do with the second half of your book, and
Okay.
particularly with Christian origins, or what you call Paleo-Christianity. And I guess I'm interested in how you interpret this figure, Jesus, as a sort of Dionysian figure. Clearly, I mean, the New Testament is steeped in the Hellenistic world. I'm not going to doubt you in any way, as are this early period. But I'm interested in what happens to Jesus the Jew, Jesus, the one who's the fulfillment of messianic expectations in your read of him, and particularly when we think about the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper, the way in which he's actually enacting a very Jewish ritual rather than one that, your take being a Dionysian one. And so what happens to Jesus the Jew? What happens to Jesus, the one who is sharing a Passover meal? What's happening to this ritual vis-a-vis a long history and trajectory of temple sacrifice and so on?
It's a great question. I didn't want to ignore Jesus the Jew. Jesus the Jew who spoke Hebrew, who spoke Aramaic, is very different from the Jesus who's portrayed in John's Gospel. I think that's important. I mean, there's the Jesus who I'll get there. There's the Jesus who purportedly lived and breathed in ancient Israel and Palestine, and there's the Jesus who's written about in Greek a couple generations later. I mean, we think John's gospel, and I focus on his gospel for a reason, as the last gospel we think was written, closer to the end of the first century. And we think, based on the sources, that he's writing for the community in Ephesus. Again, we don't know if that's the case, but in the community in Ephesus, that wouldn't have been a Jewish community.
Gross.
I think we'll just wait for the connection to kick back in. You're back, Brian. You're back.
Am I back?
Yeah.
Sorry. I tried to run for a second. I'm back. Are we stable?
Mm-hmm.
So what was I saying? So John's community in Ephesus. Again, it's just, each of the gospel writers portrays a different Jesus, right? And I think in John's gospel, just that sixth chapter is just very, very striking to me. And I don't know why Jesus is being portrayed in this Dionysian sense. And it's not just in the sixth chapter, but that Eucharist language is awfully strange. And I always come back to John 6:60. I mean, how do we explain John 6:60? How do we explain when the Jewish people gathered hearing these words from Jesus called skleros? How do we explain that word Greek, skleros? Why do they call the feasting on his flesh and blood skleros, like difficult, hard to accept, sclerotic, we use in English? Why would they call the Holy Eucharist sclerotic? I think it's because cannibalism was anathema to the Jewish world. There aren't many Passover meals where human flesh and blood is being served up. And so although obviously it's built on a Jewish substrate, for some reason, the John and the Eucharist specifically coming across in John's gospel, it's reeking of Greek pagan imagery. I don't know why that's the case, but again, John 6:60 is pretty clear that his message wasn't translating to the people of the time.
Thank you. So my other question has to do with the conclusion of your book and where you see the implications of your scholarship for the contemporary church. And I suspect that you have a bit of a roadmap here where you talk about, contemporary Christianity being this dying thing and the Eucharist being a placebo of sorts, and that there may be some reinvigoration of religion, particularly Christianity, if we were to understand the Eucharist in this kind of way. And so I guess I want to ask the broader question that I would ask religious studies students, and that is, like, what is the religious experience to you? Is it necessarily something that is ecstatic and transcendental? Or might we say something else about the nature of religious experience, and particularly of religious mysticism? So is mysticism necessarily this otherworldly experience, or is it one that's deeply embedded? And I guess this is related to my first question about Judaism, embedded within this world rather than an escape from this world?
That's a very good question, actually. I think it's Jung, is it Jung who says that, we shouldn't let religion be a defense to religious experience. And in the very beginning of the book, I think I quote also Brother David Steindl-Rast, who talks about the origins of religion as being based on experience, even mystical experience. Whether it's Moses in the burning bush or Paul being struck blind by that heaven-sent light on the road to Damascus. These are not psychedelic experiences, I don't think. But these are otherworldly experiences. These are sometimes visionary experiences. I mean, Paul, who writes most of the books of the New Testament, never met Jesus in the flesh. He's converted by auditory hallucinations and claims supernatural communication with the Christ, and he becomes the greatest evangelist for this religion. Now the world's biggest religion. It came from a guy who never met Jesus. I think Elaine Pagel says it best. There is no Christianity without the visionary experience. Peter's enters a trance state in Acts. So it wasn't just Paul, it was also Peter and the saints who follow them. Now I don't know what that primary religious experience looks like. Does it have to be, this non-rational, ecstatic event that blows your mind and rends time and space? I don't know. I mean, I've never done psychedelics, but I'm very interested in mystical experience. I've had experiences under the tutelage of the Jesuits that I would describe as mystical, where I've sensed the sacredness of life very much in the absence of drugs, through different meditation and prayer and things like this. For even in my life today, I sort of engage in an everyday mysticism, trying to find that spark of the divine in the other. I think that's the whole point. And for me, it's not so much the intensity or the ecstasy of the experience. I think that, even a lot of these early psychedelic researchers were talking about it not being altered states, but altered traits. And so in the end, it's almost a false choice. I think the genuine mystical experience, in my opinion, is the experience that brings you back to earth, that makes you a person of service, that puts you in a position to feel and appreciate love, and to put that towards the betterment of humanity. I mean, I think that if it doesn't lead to that, in my definition, it's not a genuine mystical experience. I think that it's very much about this world. Yeah.
Well, that's a lovely place to end. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. There is a comment in the Q&A, and Catherine Tosenberger mentions some additional readings. I had a couple other questions I wanted to pose, kind of about the future of your research and the future of classics. So first, you found or rediscovered some material in Catalonia that was kind of overlooked by many. Where else are you looking for these kinds of sites that scholars may have overlooked the evidence? If you can say.
Oh, you want me to? I'm going to give away my secrets. No, I mean, I'll tell you in broad strokes. At the very end of the book, I said, I mean, what really interests me, I mean, if there's any merit to this theory, this pagan continuity theory with a psychedelic twist, if there's anything to this and there's data to be found, it's going to be in an area where the pagan mysteries are bumping up against the Christian mysteries. And there are places in the Holy Land, by the way. I mentioned those in the book. There are places like ancient Scythopolis, not far, on the eastern edge of Galilee there, where potentially something like that was happening. I think North Africa, particularly Egypt, is a great place to be looking. Anywhere in Magna Graecia, anywhere in southern Italy is a wonderful place where the Greek mysteries were introduced to the Christian mysteries, in a sense. Anywhere anywhere Paul was writing in and around Ephesus and Asia Minor, there's lots and lots of places where I generally want to figure out what Paleo Christianity was, and a lot of places in the East that have been largely overlooked in the Greek Empire as well, by the way, places like that are today in Ukraine. Who's to say? So the ergotized beer was published in Catalan, and I think that's one of the reasons it largely went overlooked, because it was published in a relatively obscure language 20 years ago. Part of me thinks that maybe there's something in Ukrainian that was published, I don't know, 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago from the Crimea. I don't know. There could be things out there that get overlooked for modern language barriers, not ancient. I don't know. But there are huge swaths of the ancient world that I think are unexplored, both from the Greek and the Christian perspective. I'm awfully interested in what today is Armenia and Georgia. Armenia was one of the first places that adopted Christianity in a countrywide scheme. There's Ethiopian Orthodoxy, by the way, which claims a very robust lineage, unbroken lineage. So there's just, growing up Catholic, there's all these places in ancient Christianity that I feel like woefully understudied in, and would love to learn more about.
In the book, especially in some of the latter chapters, you mention some examples where these knowledges and these practices are repressed. So you write about how the women keepers of the sacrament, the women keepers of these mixed brews, were repressed by church fathers. You go into the archives of repression, and are there any other examples that you are looking at where knowledge and practice of this kind of experience are repressed?
Yeah, there's I co-majored in classics and medieval studies, which is why I spent times in the archives there. What was happening in the early modern period, after the Middle Ages, obviously, or at the end, is super interesting in terms of looking for evidence like that. You could spend a lifetime in the archives of repression. That's not my phrase, by the way. That's Carlo Ginzburg. But you could spend a lifetime in the Vatican archives looking for more textual data. I think it's very, very interesting. I mean, part of what I'd like to look at more is the way that some of these practices and women as well were suppressed in the Americas, in the New World. I talk about that, I think, in the last chapter. There's lots of archives in Mexico City, for example, and elsewhere, where we get a pretty decent sense, almost a visceral sense, of the relationship between some of the Catholic or Vatican supported colonizers and indigenous practices in what today is Central America. There's lots of interesting data points there in different archives across the Americas. I wouldn't mind taking another look at.
May I just interject for one moment there? It seems to me that the church fathers did like to write a good deal about their opponents, and we often learn only know about their opponents through them, because there's not a lot of writing that's extant, for example, on Gnosticism or mystery religions, except through them. And yet, in my knowledge, there's nothing that's mentioned about hallucinogenics and, say, any of the church fathers like Tertullian of Carthage or Irenaeus of Lyon. Like, what accounts for their curious reticence, if this is in fact a practice in the patristic literature?
That's a great question. Charlie Stang and I were having this conversation too, the great scholar at Harvard. We do have there are some examples for the use of drugs in the Gnostics. Hippolytus definitely talks about it in the Refutatio Omnium Aeresium. In the Greek, actually, the word pharmakon is mentioned 7 different times over the course of not that many lines to describe, I think it was the Marcosians, if I'm not mistaken. And there are alternative Eucharists in honor of Charis, the goddess Charis of grace, that women were actually mixing. Hippolytus, I think, is the most vocal about pharmakon. Again, that word is used 7 different times in the Greek to describe their alternative Eucharist.
In one document, though, in a very large corpus of anti-heretical texts, right? So we have one document, one writer, and you say 7 references to pharmakon.
And then we have Irenaeus, who refers to the filtra and agogima in the 2nd century. Eusebius talks about the pharmacological libations and incense. Again, without getting into details on the drugs, he talks about people being, what's the word in Greek? Thambosthesestai, being like thrown into ecstasy and manias, using like kind of Dionysian language. It's when Irenaeus talks about filtra or agogama, love potions, it's hard not to think of some kind of concoction. So no, they didn't write in any great detail about it. At the same time, I'm not sure they were in a position to want to advertise these very attractive
But
potions
that's
that we.
precisely what they do against the Gnostics, right? I mean, we know a lot about the Gnostics precisely because they're so systematic in wanting to refute them. So ostensibly, they would want to refute also these practitioners of various psychedelic drugs. Were they an actual threat to the church, right? Anyway.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I hear you. It's definitely there in the Greek. It's definitely there. I wish it were more exhaustive, for sure.
There is one question that just popped up in the Q&A, and it is, could you say a little bit about the future of psychedelic therapy, and are you also suggesting that the sacrament of early Christianity was hallucinogenic in nature? So two questions.
Okay. Well, the second one first. No, I hope that's very clear. No, I am not. I'm not talking about the Last Supper. I'm not talking about the historicity of the Eucharist, what the Orthodox calls the mystical supper, and the Russian Orthodox Church calls the secret supper, by the way, which is a great phrase. So there's something very mysterious. I mean, even in the way it's talked about, there's something very mysterious about this supper. I'm not saying it was psychedelic. What I think what the book is exploring is a hypothesis that is not mine, a hypothesis that some of the early Greek-speaking communities may have availed themselves of some of this pharmacopoeia, and that it would have been a carryover of a tradition that had existed for centuries in Hellenic culture, Greek-speaking culture. I think at the very end of the book, I say that if this is in fact the case, it was probably not a majority of early Christian churches. We're talking about a minority at best, if this practice was used. And I think, again, we won't know until we do more testing. As Professor Barter points out, the texts only get us so far. And that's why I don't like relying on the texts, because they're biased and they're fragmented and they tell very incomplete pictures about the ancient past. As long as we're talking about texts, we should also mention that only about 1% of the total literary output of the ancient world has survived. 99% has disappeared. So to look at a text and claim we have any picture whatsoever of the ancient world, I think is at best, again, incomplete. This is where the philologists need to be talking to the ancient pharmacologists to put together a better picture. The sciences and the humanities can live together, I think, to help build a better picture than we have today, which is very flimsy, again, especially in the absence of a properly translated Galen. So we need to look beyond the texts for what was happening in antiquity. And until then, I don't know. Nobody knows how prevalent this was in the ancient world. It's a hypothesis. What the future of psychedelics, I have no idea. I can tell you in the US, that they're moving towards FDA approval of things like psilocybin. The researchers at Johns Hopkins and NYU have been studying psilocybin in a clinical setting for about 20 years. And it could very well be approved by the regulatory authorities here, the FDA, for anything from depression to anxiety to PTSD, end of life distress, things like this, may in fact happen in this decade, which will be very meaningful for some people. It could represent a very different path away from SSRIs and other medication pharmaceuticals. So it's an interesting place. At the same time, you also have this sacramental version of these substances, right? We're not speculating when we say that psychedelics are already involved in Christianity. Depends which Christianity you're looking at. I mean, according to the UDV, the Untitled Chapter, this Brazilian-born church, they use ayahuasca today in their ceremonies. Now, we can have a debate over what kind of Christianity that is, or you can talk about the Native American church, which is this syncretic version of indigenous and Christian worship. They use peyote, so we're not talking in the abstract here. Psychedelics do form a meaningful part of bona fide liturgy for people who would identify as Christians today in the United States and probably in Canada, I would imagine. So what that means going forward, I don't know, but it's happening already.
Professor Barter, did you have a last question?
I think I'd like to hear from others at this point. Thank you.
Okay. We don't have any other questions that have popped up in the chat. So I just have one last question, unless you wanted to go ahead. No? Okay. So the last question for me is, we've seen some classics departments be cut recently in the United States and in Canada. And your book is a really passionate defense of classics. In fact, at the end of the book, you write, classics saved your life. And you also write at various points in the book, classics can help to save the world from some of the crises we're facing. So can you elaborate on why you feel so strongly about classics as a discipline and the lessons it has for us today in the contemporary world?
Do you still have me?
Yeah,
I wonder if
I can hear
okay,
you.
good.
Yeah.
Yes, and I'll start by saying that you'd be surprised how many emails I get from people around the world saying they want to start learning ancient Greek, which is I think is the best email I ever received, by the way, because it's not very popular right now. The death of classical education is a real thing, and I love that book that I reference by Hansen and Heath throughout my book about the death of a field of study that has been with us for a long time and always on the edge of extinction. And here we are again. When I say they saved my life, I mean that in a real way. I was the first person in my family to go to college from a pretty rough neighborhood in urban Philadelphia. The middle son of 3 Catholic boys. My older brother didn't go to college. My younger brother didn't go to college. And the only reason I went to college is because the Jesuits taught me Latin and Greek. And for some reason, I really took a shine to it. And it's the only reason I got a Bachelor of Arts from Brown on a scholarship, by the way. And the Jesuits gave me a scholarship too. And I'm the beneficiary of lots of mentors and lots of kind people who took a chance on a little wise ass from Northeast Philadelphia. And it was the classics of all things that put me on this path and got me into law and practicing the way I am today. So I owe the classics a lot, quite frankly, and it's emotional for me. But yeah, as abstract and wonky as this discipline is, I think it holds great value. I'm not saying anything original here. Mary Beard says it much more eloquently than me, but I think she says something like, to cut off the classics, to get rid of that system of education is like to cut off one of our limbs and expect us to walk forward. It is the foundation. The Greco-Roman foundation certainly inspired the founding fathers, most, if not all of whom read some Latin and Greek, and inspired the Enlightenment values that gave birth to our modern democracies. And so, if this silly little hunt for psychedelics has any merit, I hope it's in the power of antiquity and the power of a humanities-based education, which I benefited from at Brown, just being able to study whatever the hell I wanted for 4 years. And it made me the man I am today. I wasn't pre-law or pre-med, that came afterwards. But for 4 glorious years, I just read a bunch of nonsense in all these ancient languages. And they were, together with my years with the Jesuits, some of the 8 fondest years of my life, while I was trying to unroll a lot of trauma from childhood, quite frankly. And there were the classics with me every single day. It was Virgil, it was Homer, who turned me into a man. And so, yeah, I have nothing but respect for those and the people who keep it alive.
I think that there's a couple other comments in the Q&A, but I can capture those and email them to you for your perusal. I just want to thank you again very much for being here today and sharing your research and answering the questions of Professor Barter and myself. Thanks, Professor Barter, for being here as well. And Brian, I think a lot of people are looking forward to following your next research journey. So,
Thank you. There's more on the way. There's more on the way.
Well, thank you for making Christianity interesting once again.
It's pretty interesting to begin with, but yeah, it's yes, it's certainly it's a new part of the conversation, and I think one that is worth talking about. You know, right, wrong, or indifferent. There's a lot of mystery at the birth of that faith, and I think it's worth investigating.
For sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for being here, and everyone out there. Thank you for attending. Everybody stay safe. Everyone take care of one another, and hope to chat with you soon. Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.